Our gospel lesson this morning comes from Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah. For from you come a ruler who is to shepherd my people, Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, Excuse me. Excuse me. then then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may go and pay him homage." And when they had heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star, and they had seen it at its rising until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Will you pray with me? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. As we had Epiphany this year, there were people who stormed our Capitol building. And of course, I hope that most of you have gotten the letter that I sent in response to that. Epiphany is a revealing of God on this earth. And so in the story of Epiphany, we have the Magi who saw a star and they followed it. And when they got to King Herod, they asked where the Christ child must be, because what we have to realize is that this probably happened a couple of years after Jesus was born. This was nothing immediate. And so they asked where Jesus was, and he did not know, but he did not want another king. He was to be king, and he was jealous. And so he told them, "Go and find this Christ child, and when you find the Christ child, come back and tell me where he is so that I may go and worship him." And of course, Herod had no intention of worshiping Jesus. His intention was to kill Jesus so that Jesus could not grow up to be king. And the Magi, the wise men, they went and they worshiped and they brought their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And because of their three gifts, we often assume that there were three Magi. That may or may not have been true. But what we do know is that there were three gifts and that they gave them to the Christ child. And presumably this trip, this 2-year long journey, changed their lives. How could it not? And as they worshiped, they became even closer to God. And they were warned in a dream to go back a different way. And so they went back a different way. And they never stopped to tell Herod where the Christ child was. And so, of course, this led to another sequence of events in which Herod decided to rule that every child under the age of 2 should be killed, every boy child under the age of 2. But the epiphany here is that God revealed God's self to the Magi when they were warned in a dream to go a different way. And we talk about having epiphanies today when a realization comes out of nowhere. The definition is really that there's a manifestation of God, of Christ, in our world. And it's interesting to me that the Capitol was stormed on Epiphany, because I am not going to say that the storming of the Capitol was in any way a manifestation of God in our world. God is not for violence. And certainly the storming of our Capitol is violence. And if you remember during the Black Lives Matter riots, I talked about how violence is never the answer. And I repeat that again now, that violence is never the answer. And it seems to be that it was a matter of, at least for some people, I'm assuming they went to the Capitol not really intending on storming the building. But they got caught up in the voices of those who said, if you are a patriot, you will come forward. And so there were, I assume, people who went forward even though they never intended on going forward, on letting it go that far. But 4 lives were lost that day and 1 later. And so where do we see the manifestation of God in such work? I think we see it in the response. Because what I have heard is calls for peace, mixed in with a lot of people who are afraid of what could happen next, but calls for peace, calls for unity. I don't know that I have ever seen a time when this nation was so divided. And we desperately need to remember that we are one nation. And that even when we disagree, we are still one nation. And in fact, I believe that our nation is all the stronger because we can disagree and learn to live with and accept one another, even with our differences of opinion. But friends, this went further than a difference of opinion. These were people who decided to take matters into their own hands, and there were those who said that they were going to kill the people who didn't agree. That is not of God. Violence is not of God. God is love. And because God is love, God calls us to be people of love, to love God and to love our neighbor. And our neighbor means everyone. So we don't get to choose not to love someone because they are on the other side of the political spectrum. And we don't get to decide to not love someone because they look different than we do. And we don't get to decide not to love someone because they do things differently than we do. We don't get to decide not to love someone even when they believe differently than we do. God's people are a very diverse people. And I, for one, think that it is beautiful. So I want to go back to this Epiphany story for a few minutes because I think it speaks to this. Because the Magi traveled for 2 years. Now, that is a long walk. And so, what we have to understand is that they came from an entirely different part of the world. They came from a place with different customs and different beliefs, and they probably looked differently and thought differently from the other people in Bethlehem. And they came. They followed a star because the star appeared and they knew that it was leading them to something special, to someone special. And they followed that star with their hearts open, ready to be transformed. And they gave their gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And yes, I understand those are strange gifts to give to a baby, but they were the most valuable gifts that these magi had to give. And they gave these gifts. And when they gave these gifts,
I couldn't believe that I kept
they continued to grow closer to God. I want you to continue to think of the beauty of the diversity that these magi brought. They didn't look the same, they didn't think the same, they didn't act the same, but they loved. They loved Christ, they loved their fellow people, and they believed that the world was going to be changed through this child who was born in a stable. And so here we are. We've reached and gone past Epiphany. But we too believe that the world can be changed through this light, don't we? We believe the world can be changed when we reach beyond ourselves and our own boundaries to love and care for others, even if those others are not the same as us. And you know what happens when we do that? That love, my friends, that love is of God. And God will bless it. And so, yes, it hurt to watch what happened at the Capitol. It was painful to see what had become of the country. It was even more painful when I opened up my Facebook Messenger and started getting messages from my friends across the world and the way that they were viewing what was happening at the Capitol. But here's what I know it happened on Epiphany. And that means that God brings light to the darkness. And friends, if there was ever a time that we needed that light, it is now. And God brings it. And God brings it in abundance. And so now we are on the brink of something new. And sometimes something new is scary. But something new is also the opportunity for God to work and to bring wonderful things to the world. And so we've reached 2021. We're getting word of the vaccines that will reach beyond just well, I shouldn't say just, but beyond the healthcare workers, which we are grateful that they're getting vaccinated, beyond those in the nursing homes, and we're grateful again. But the vaccine is reaching further, and perhaps it will bring an end to this pandemic that has changed the world as we know it. We are looking at some changes in Washington, and whether or not you agree or voted for Biden, he has, at least in speeches, agreed to work with everyone. And so we trust God that we come through this era and that we can learn to love again. And we can learn to get past the violence and work toward peace. Because we still have people in Washington representing all ends of the spectrum. We still have people in this world representing all ends of the spectrum. And God can use our melting pot to bring forth wonderful things. Friends, there is light. And we must see that light. Amen.